the conflict at that point had become deeply localized. When you use the term Free Syrian Army at that phase, it was extremely difficult to talk about an organization. This was a movement. This was an idea, not an organization. The complexity of the conflict has also provided an open space for misinformation and disinformation. The rise of social media has given even more space to that. And so the importance of acquiring accurate information is more important than ever. Moreover, the conflict in Syria has also provided space for extremist groups, which has been discussed already during your committee hearing. Sadly, extremist groups or jihadist groups have become sexy subjects, particularly for the media, and all too often the presence of these groups has glossed over or left the other actors to become virtually irrelevant in terms of public perception. That has fed some of the misunderstanding surrounding the complexity of the conflict. Syria has also been the most brutal conflict in modern history, and the Bashar al-Assad regime has committed every single war crime in the book. According to open source public human rights monitors, at least 89% of civilian casualties in Syria have been caused by the Assad regime. ISIS has been a truly horrific organization, but to put it into context, ISIS is accused of killing only 2% of the civilian casualties in the entirety of the Syrian conflict. It's also important to remember the relationship that the Bashar al-Assad regime has maintained with jihadist organizations, including ISIS, over the last 15 years, beginning in 2003. ISIS would never have been the organization it has over the last several years if it hadn't been for some of that cooperation, which was particularly intense during 2003 to 2010, just prior to the conflict that we're talking about. To talk about the conflict specifically, and I'll try to wrap this up relatively briefly, from early on in the emergence of an armed resistance in Syria, there was no centralized attempt by the international community to control or to unite this fledgling, emerging armed resistance. Between the middle of 2011, when the Free Syrian Army first emerged, until the end of 2012, there was no Western effort to support the armed opposition. And within that 18-month or 1.5-year period, there was an extraordinarily chaotic effort undertaken separately, not together, by GCC states and by Turkey to pick out their own respective proxies on the ground and throw huge amounts of money and military support to those groups. That chaotic, messy reality has paved the path towards where we are today, which is a very troubling environment, which many of your speakers have already talked about. But I wanted to stress just a few points as context before the question session. The first one is that the decision made in the end of 2012 by Western states and the international community to support moderate elements of the armed opposition was the right decision, but it was wrong in the sense that it was done on too small of a scale, which I believe your former Special Envoy Koos van Dam implied earlier, and it was done far too late. That chaotic environment that we saw develop over the first 18 months made our collective efforts virtually impossible, given the fact that it took us so long to decide to do them. And a heavily decentralized and very locally focused armed resistance movement has also provided the space for rife criminality, which has been extensively discussed, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. It has also encouraged groups to pursue very specifically local objectives at the expense of national values and national interests, including human rights. And that goes across the board, across all of the armed opposition, including the Kurdish YPG and the PYD political party, including the regime and including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think it would be very hard to find any actor in Syria who hasn't committed the kind of crimes that we've been discussing or I've been hearing about so far today. Another point I wanted to make very clear at the outset is that localized cooperation between moderate elements of the opposition and extremist groups like Al-Qaeda has and did happen, undoubtedly, but largely as a result of the dynamics that I've explained so far. The deeply chaotic environment, the extraordinarily brutal nature of the conflict, and the collective lack of a sufficient enough effort by the international community